In this episode, I'm going to be interviewing games designer Conor Harris, also known as Sovereign Echo, on the recent balance changes made in version 1.4 Total Subjugation for Sins of a Solar Empire 2. Welcome to the pod.
Hello, and nice to be here. I'm Sovereign Echo. I'm the game designer.
So, Echo, what is it that you actually do on Sins of a Solar Empire 2?
Oh, well, what do I not do on Sins of a Solar Empire 2? So, being a game designer entails quite a lot of things. Probably my day-to-day most done thing would be balance and designing of new features. Two different things, I understand. But beyond that, I'm also responsible for quite a lot of overseeing of various code and art features and making sure everything ties together. I do a lot of the setup for the artists as well on the code side so that they can get their things.
I see. So you're not just purely focused on balancing game mechanics then, you're actually kind of gluing together stuff from the rest of the team too.
Yes, I am.
So the version of 1.4 Total Subjugation, it's a very big update, wouldn't you say?
One of the biggest.
And there's a lot of changes, and small and large. It improves the gameplay of Sins of a Solar Empire 2 in a pretty big way, in my opinion. And it's my understanding that many of these changes were formulated in response to feedback from the Sins of a Solar Empire 2 player community. What were the main complaints, would you say, or requests coming in from the community in the run-up to the development of this patch?
So, particularly for the combat rebalance, a lot of it was, I don't want to say community-driven, but community-informed.
In the sense that you'd be collecting feedback from the community, just checking out, see where the game meta is, what people are complaining about, you know, if there's anything that feels a little bit overtuned, unbalanced, or overpowered, that kind of thing?
Well, there are two different directions that feed into the combat rebalance in this instance. Firstly, there's the more obvious one, balance. Although, when I say combat rebalance, it's really more about the feel of combat and the tactical options available to the player, driven by how long their ships last in combat. And that leads into the second part, which is not about which faction was more powerful, but how does combat feel overall? You see, Sins is quite unique from a lot of our other RTSs in that our units are ships that have a lot of weight to them. They don't just turn on a dime. When you commit to an attack or even just a move, you commit. You have to spend 10, 15, 30 seconds waiting for your ships to execute the turn and then the move. They can't just withdraw if you make a mistake. Because of that, we also can't allow lethality to be too high, because when you have to commit so much time into even just making an order, if lethality is also too high, every order becomes a potential final order. And, well, that's not very good, because then there's no chance for the player to affect the outcome of the battle with their continued actions after the battle begins. Not to mention, there isn't any time for the player to enjoy the gorgeous aesthetics of our space battles, which is certainly one of the main selling points of the game, I would say.
Absolutely, and with a game that is so kind of tactically rich, with so much content in terms of the amount of ships, the different weapon systems, or the physics systems that are in the game now in Sins of Solar Empire 2, the different firing arcs, modelled missiles, ship abilities, there's loads of stuff in there, right? And if the battles are over a little bit too quickly, it's clear that the player doesn't always get to experience all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So the increase to effective hit points across the board wasn't about changing the power levels of one faction or another. It was about making sure that the player would have enough time to enjoy the battle, both from a tactical standpoint and an aesthetic standpoint.
And also, as well, when you're talking about the kind of the reduction in lethality, I feel that that's quite a powerful game design decision, because, as you say, every decision, whether it's moving your ships into a particularly dangerous position, it needs to have weight, right? And I think that even with increasing the size of the hit point pool so that the battles are lasting a little bit longer, it still doesn't take away from how important it is. Like, I've been playing the new patch, and if you move a capital ship into the middle of a kill zone, essentially, you're still going to lose the capital ship, right? It's not like it's things have really like slowed down to a crawl. It's actually still quite a fast and responsive game, and you've got to know what you're doing. And a canny player can take advantage of these situations in order to quite rapidly take stuff out.
Yeah, and I think it goes nicely into how we were informed by the community in this regard. There's a gigantic thread on the Discord about how combat was too short, but it also often was talking about how people fielded very large fleets of capital ships and didn't tend to want to field smaller ships. Now, there were more balance factors involved in that have since been addressed, but one of the key takeaways of that was that, well, people liked the longevity that massive capital ship fleets brought to them, and so it was important that we bring more of that longevity to the entire fleet, including capital ships, so that you could feel like you could field large groups of smaller ships without them just evaporating the moment somebody throws some kind of area of effect damage around.
Ships in general are a little bit more survivable. You've also made some efforts to kind of make some of the smaller ships actually a little bit more useful in the later game by adding some new ship abilities.
Yeah, so I wanted to add new abilities that would allow you to both invest further into a single ship class to give you a bit more chance to express your way of playing the game, and also to bring more tactical nuance to those particular ships. So that allows me to talk about another aspect of this patch, which is missile balance. Missiles were changed a fair bit in this patch as well, so that they can't just be shot down in one shot every time. But that presented some new and interesting challenges, and that's why 2 out of the 3 missile frigates have received new abilities that allow them to fire missiles that have different properties. So the Javelin missile cruiser, for example, it's already in a spot where its missiles getting through point defense grids is a more nuanced challenge. But I wanted to make sure that if you'd invested heavily into a Javelin build as TEC, that you would be able to have some agency in still forcing some missiles through even a very well-defended enemy fleet. And that's where the breaker missile comes in. The breaker missile is not just faster, it's also armored by default. And so a Javelin group can fire off a salvo of breaker missiles, and with careful timing, those breaker missiles may even draw fire from the enemy point defense grid and allow the normal missiles behind the salvo to land on the target. But I also didn't want to make any abilities that were arduous or taxing for the player to use. It's important with Sins that we have a low skill floor and a high skill ceiling. You shouldn't feel that you must have extremely high APM in order to use any given unit or ability. But you should feel that if you do use it consciously and carefully, that you gain considerable value from doing so. So all of the abilities that we added to these units are specifically set up to have fairly effective autocast conditions, but also have careful timing associated with them as well. So like I said earlier with the breaker missile, if you just let your Javelises do their thing and don't worry about it, then they'll fire their missiles and they'll be in amongst the salvo and they'll be effective. But if you time it more carefully, then you can use the breaker missile to screen for regular missiles as well.
I think that's nice as well, because some of the other factions have actually got some new tools now with which to fight back against missiles. And part of the balance patch actually was designed to make the interactions between missiles and point defense a little bit easier for players to read.
Yes. So in amongst our missile balance changes, we reduced the number of missiles being fired. One of the things we were noticing was that so many missiles were being fired and they were kind of overlapping on top of each other that the VFX of a missile being successfully shot down by a point defense grid was being buried in visual noise. And so we were receiving a lot of complaints from players about how their point defense wasn't being effective, when in actual fact, their point defense was being partially effective. So they would be witnessing missiles still hitting their ship, but because of the visual noise, they weren't witnessing the missiles that were being shot down along the way. So now, with less missiles being fired, but being fired more regularly, it's easier to see when point defense is being effective. You can see every missile that's shot down more clearly now.
That's great. I think readability is really important in these kind of games because part of the pleasure that you get from playing a tactical combat game is when you see your tactics work, you feel good as you see those Garda flak frigates fly into range just in time to be able to shoot down a bunch of missiles. You get that payback. And I think the clearer that is, the more fun the game is going to be for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Echo, let's talk about some of the new ships that have been added in this patch, because this wasn't just a balance patch. There's new mechanics added, but we've also added some new ships too. So the TEC gained a new Stilat missile corvette ship, and this makes a return from Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion, if I'm understanding it right. But it's kind of in a new form. How does this new Stilat differ from the original, and what's its intended purpose in the TEC arsenal?
Yeah, so in Sins Rebellion, the two different corvettes were armed the same way and just had different passive abilities and were faction aligned. We've changed tack a little bit for Sins 2, and in this instance, the Stilat missile corvette was brought back with a pure missile armament to complement the Shriken's pure autocannon armament. Now, this was particularly important for the TEC to pick up, not so much because of the ship itself, ironically, but because of what it enables strategically. You see, the Sova carrier has an ability called Mobile Corvette Factory, which does what it says on the tin, allows the Sova to build corvettes. But all it could build was the Scout and the Shriken. Now, the Shriken is all right, but the Shriken loses utility as the game goes on because it's equipped mostly with lighter weapons, and when ships get really big, the light weapons become less effective, and there are more area of effect damage around that just kill off massive balls of Shrikens. So what we wanted to do was add in another corvette that the Sova was capable of constructing that filled a different role to the Shriken, and thus the Stilat was brought back from Sins 1 with a heavy missile armament. So now, if you start the game picking the Sova carrier as the TEC, your strategic options are far more interesting than they were prior to the patch. The Shriken will still form the bulk of your corvette force early on, as it's much cheaper than the Stilat, but you can pick up the Stilat in order to allow this Sova plus corvette force to engage enemy capital ships and static defenses way more effectively. You can actually win off of this strategy rather than just annoy the enemy.
And the Stilat is pretty effective, right? I had a bunch of them fighting against some heavy cruisers, and the heavy cruisers could not target those things at all. And they really struggled.
Well, if those heavy cruisers had enough tracking speed boosts, then they certainly could target the corvette, but that's for an article another day.
I see. So I've found that they've got great utility being able to zip behind the backline and actually take out crippled ships or any ships that are, trying to escape. So they're really quick as well. They've got this ability to kind of like come out of nowhere essentially and pick off ships that are really, really, really low on hit points.
Yeah, so the TEC corvettes, one of their primary features is their speed. They have a engine speed upgrade unique to the TEC, and that allows their corvettes to be far more reactive and also to avoid enemy fire more effectively. Though there is a secondary and more nuanced role involved in the Stilat as well. And because it's firing missiles, simply by it being in a corvette ball, every missile it fires will draw fire from enemy point defense. And that fire is therefore drawn away from the corvettes. So it actually serves something of a survivability role in the corvette ball as well. And yes, like you say, it has 400 PS missiles. They don't do a ton of damage, but they allow you to target heavier units like heavy cruisers and finish them off really quickly. They're actually unique missiles compared to the rest of the TEC roster in that they don't maneuver very well, but they accelerate very quickly so that they can cover the short distance between the Stilat and the target properly and swiftly. A little more like rockets, really, than missiles.
Let's turn to the Vasari, because the Vasari have actually got two new ships. First, we're going to look at the Junsarak Warden. I hope I said that right. It's a dual-purpose, effective point defense solution. It also boasts light missiles for hunting enemy corvettes. Again, how is this one different from its Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion counterpart, and how does it help the Vasari combat both the TEC and the Advent?
Yeah, so the Junsarak in Sins 1 was the flak unit as well, and it only used missiles in Sins 1. Well, Nowadays, hitting a fighter with a missile is quite a challenging task in Sins 2, so it was important that we also added point defense. But also, hitting a missile with a missile would be even more challenging, and the point defense allows the Junserak to take out missiles in Sins 2, which is a new role for point defense units in Sins 2 overall. There were a few reasons why this ship had to be added, and why it had to be free as well. You see, the Vasari actually already have a flak unit, the Sulfurak Defensor. But that's a corvette. Why is that important? Because flak units are the primary counter to enemy corvettes. Now, the Defensor is an excellent counter to corvettes, and it does a very good job of screening against missiles as well. It's not that the Defensor wasn't doing its job, it's that it was arguably doing it too well. You see, in a Vasari versus Vasari matchup, when the only platform for killing enemy corvettes is itself a corvette, what we were seeing was massive, massive corvette balls being built and thrown at each other in this really kind of bland industrial mirror match. And so we wanted to break that particular loop by adding in a frigate that could take out other corvettes that would be effective against other Vasari players. And not only that, but the Sulfurak Defensor, while it's very effective at point defense, it wants to be on top of the fire of the missiles, not really defending the fleet per se. And so it's a little more specialist in its flak role. And I believe its flak role is still very much intact in that regard. But the Junserak adds a similar functionality to the other factions' flak units in that it can be alongside the rest of the fleet, providing point defense fire.
And it also comes out quite early in the tech tree too.
Yes, it does. Flak units generally need to be available fairly early, especially when their main role is to counter corvettes, which also come out quite early in the tech tree. It was important as well with the Junserak that we maintain the key theme of the Vasari in multi-role units. It's very rare that they have a unit that just does only one thing. And so the Junserak is armed with both missiles and point defense in order to allow some more nuance to how the unit is used and generally follow along with the Vasari theme of multi-role frigates.
And talking about the Vasari theme of multi-roles and kind of having this idea that there's less of the Vasari, right? They're kind of like a dwindling race in terms of how many there are around to fight the war. And they've got a new fighter as well, and it very much follows that combat doctrine of less is more. So this is the heavy fighter strike craft, and it helps them better defend their heavy bombers and target enemy strike craft as well. So how do the Vasari utilize these new fighters, and how do they differ from those fielded by the other factions?
So the heavy fighter for the Vasari is fielded in fairly small numbers, only 2 fighters per squadron compared to the other factions, which have 6 and 8. But these fighters, oh boy, these fighters are well armed and very well armored. They're unique in that they're the only strike craft in the game that has shields by default. The Advent can access shields for their fighters, but only temporarily through abilities.
So they're very, very difficult to kill.
Yes, they are. Thematically, it was important again. The Vasari are not only multi-role, but they're also elite, and this fighter leans into the elite theme quite heavily. And from the lore perspective, they don't have a lot of people to throw away in endless meat grinder tactics. They do have access to cloning technology, but they prefer not to overuse that because, well, you clone a clone too many times and suddenly you won't be able to populate the Vasari species at all.
Moving on from the new ships, tell me about the new population and allegiance mechanics. How do they work, and what do they add to the strategic and economic gameplay of Sins 2?
Population serves a couple of different roles in Sins 2, both mechanical and narrative. From the narrative standpoint, what we wanted to convey was that the space you're fighting over belonged to the trade order. Before the Vasari arrived, before the Advent invaded, there were people living on these planets. And they still live on these planets, even with the war raging around them. And this is why population is already present on a planet before you colonize it. And also why when you lose a planet, the population remains in place. From a mechanical standpoint, it was also important to add population to add a more granular way of damaging economies. Now, previously, a planet was either functioning at full capacity, or the moment it hit 0 HP, it was functioning at no capacity because it was dead, or lost to your empire at least. And that created quite binary mechanical outcomes where you either had to siege a planet to absolute completion, or it would be worthless. With population in place, and much of the planet's income now based on how much population is on that planet, any bombardment of that planet will have an immediate impact on the economy. A very small impact at first, of course, but the more you bombard, the more population will be killed, and the more of an impact it will have. It's also important as a way to gate the snowball of the aggressor. So, sure, you can damage the defender's economy, but if you successfully take the planet, well, since the population persists through change of ownership of the planet, the more you bomb it, the less you have to capture after the end of it all. Congratulations, you managed to seize the enemy's planet. It's also an irradiated wasteland. There's not a lot of money to be made anymore until you repair it, until the population comes back.
So I understand then that culture is a much more important mechanic now in Sins of a Solar Empire 2, because culture is one of the primary ways that you can affect this allegiance, this idea that the philosophy and the culture, the loyalty to the owners, it doesn't immediately switch just because you bombed a planet out, right? It usually has the opposite effect. If you bomb somebody, they're not going to like you. And so you can't immediately reap economic rewards from that planet. You've got to actually be careful about how you expand out, and you've got to use culture in a more aggressive way, I'd say.
Yeah, indeed. So this makes culture more important for all of the factions. Neutral population will work for your empire, all well and good, but every percentage of allied population is going to increase the amount of value you get from their economic output. It's also possible, however, for enemy culture to take hold on your planets and for the enemy to convince your people that, hey, maybe working for the invading alien overlords isn't actually a great idea. And so, much as in real life, when your workers are unhappy, well, they're going to work less hard and going to be less productive. So, if enemy culture takes hold on your planet, every percentage will be a penalty. Allegiance in population also persists through planet loss as well. And so when you're taking over core enemy territory, there's a high likelihood that they probably have quite a bit of allied pop there. And so that further reduces the immediate value of taking over enemy land.
And so this acts as kind of like a natural way, like you say, to kind of slow down the snowballing of an empire that's quickly taking a lot of territory, right? They're not able to immediately reap the full economic rewards of, a newly subjugated planet. Because, for a start, you've got to populate it, but then, you've got this allegiance as well. So it can actually help to preload your opponents with your culture so that they're a little bit more tuned to your way of life after you come in.
Yes, indeed. The other reason to add allegiance, of course, is, well, the Advent. In Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion, culture was a cornerstone of their playstyle, and we intend this to be the case in Sins 2 as well. Culture was reasonably powerful for them before, and indeed, in particular moments of balance, extremely powerful, but not in a particularly satisfying way. And with the addition of population and allegiance, we see a chance to add more long-term and satisfying gameplay to the Advent culture focus. And in that regard, this is really just the beginning of what you're going to be seeing with the Advent's capacity to manipulate culture and allied population.
So there might be some new stuff coming then.
Of course, I can't speak about it in any more detail than that, but yes.
Okay, that sounds exciting. Echo, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to me about the stuff that's going on with Sins of a Solar Empire 2, and particularly the Total Subjugation patch. I know you guys put so much effort into it, and that I think the community are going to be happy with the way that the changes bring out the core gameplay of Sins of a Solar Empire 2.
Thanks. I really appreciate the chance to talk to the community as well. This game is very much my passion as well as my job, and any chance to go on about the balance.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Sovereign. And everybody, take care. We'll catch you next time.